In July 1940, the American Army faced a serious problem. Europe was burning in the flames of war, and the U.S. didn't have a light reconnaissance vehicle capable of operating in any conditions. Army motorcycles got stuck in the mud, trucks were too heavy, and passenger cars broke down on rough terrain. The War Department sent out technical specifications to 135 American automakers. The requirements seemed impossible. Weight no more than 1,300 pounds, four-wheel drive, ability to transport 3 soldiers with equipment, 16 inches of ground clearance, and the craziest condition of all: submit a working prototype in 49 days. Most companies simply ignored the proposal. Too short a deadline, too strict requirements, unclear contract prospects. But a small company called Willys Overland from Toledo, Ohio, decided to take the risk. Willys' chief engineer, Delmar Roos, understood that 49 days wasn't enough time to design a car from scratch. They needed to use everything that already existed. He took the chassis from a light truck, an in-house engine producing 60 horsepower, and simplified the design as much as possible. The engineers worked around the clock. They slept 4 hours a day, right there in the workshops. Blueprints were sent to production while the ink was still wet. They assembled the first prototype in 47 days, 2 days ahead of schedule. There was one problem, though. The vehicle weighed 2,250 pounds instead of the required 1,300. That was almost twice the allowable weight. But when the military saw what this vehicle could do, they forgot about the weight. They called the prototype the Quad. It easily climbed slopes of 60 degrees, forded streams up to the axles, reached speeds of 65 miles per hour. During testing, the Quad drove 3,500 miles over the toughest road military engineers could find. 2 other manufacturers also submitted their prototypes: American Bantam and Ford. The Army tested all 3 vehicles simultaneously. In the end, the Willys design won, with its engine, which proved to be the most powerful and reliable. In July 1941, the company received a contract to produce 16,000 vehicles, designated the Willys MB. Where the name Jeep came from is still not precisely known. Several theories exist, and each one is plausible in its own way. The Army designation for the vehicle was GP, General Purpose Vehicle. Soldiers quickly turned those 2 letters into Jeep. It was easier to pronounce, more memorable. Another version is connected to a popular comic strip of the time. In the Popeye the Sailor series, there was a character named Eugene, a small, fantastic creature they called simply Jeep. This creature could walk through walls, appear wherever needed, and perform any task. When soldiers saw what the new vehicle could do, the comparison was obvious. There's also a third theory. In Army slang, the word Jeep referred to any new, unproven equipment. New recruits were sometimes called Jeeps too. Perhaps the name just stuck to the vehicle, as often happens with military jargon. Either way, by the end of 1941, everyone, from privates to generals, called the Willys MB simply Jeep. The name proved so successful that after the war, Willys registered it as a trademark. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II. By this point, The U.S. Army had received about 50,000 Jeeps, but this was catastrophically insufficient for a two-front war. Production ramped up to full capacity. Auto giant Ford joined Willys, receiving a license to produce an identical model under the designation GPW. Factories operated around the clock in 3 shifts. A significant portion of the workers were women. The men were going off to fight. At peak production in 1943, 1 Jeep rolled off the assembly lines every 80 seconds. This was an unprecedented pace for the automotive industry of the time. Throughout the entire war, they produced over 640,000 vehicles, more than any other military vehicle. Jeeps were shipped to all fronts: to North Africa, where British forces were fighting Rommel's Afrika Korps; to Europe, where preparations for the continental invasion were underway; to Pacific Islands, where American infantry was slowly, island by island, advancing toward Japan; to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. The Jeep received its first baptism by fire in North Africa in the winter of 1942. American troops landed in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch. The desert became the ideal testing ground for the new vehicle. In the Sahara sands, it became clear that the Jeep could do things other vehicles couldn't. Wide tires didn't sink into the sand. The simple engine wasn't afraid of dust that killed more complex motors. The open body allowed soldiers to instantly exit the vehicle when under fire. Scouts and Jeeps ventured into the desert tens of miles from the main forces. They found enemy positions, determined routes for tank columns, conducted daring raids on enemy supply lines. The Germans nicknamed the American scouts in Jeeps the Desert Ghosts. They appeared out of nowhere, struck, and disappeared behind the dunes. Military engineers designed the Jeep as a reconnaissance vehicle, but soldiers quickly found dozens of other uses for it. Army ingenuity transformed a simple automobile into a universal tool of war. The most common application was mounting weapons. They installed a Browning heavy machine gun, .50 caliber, on Jeeps. This created a mobile firing point capable of quickly changing position. The machine gun was mounted on a special swivel behind the front seats, and one of the crew members became the gunner. Some units went further and mounted bazookas, anti-tank grenade launchers, on Jeeps. Of course, they had to fire from a stationary position, but the speed allowed them to quickly jump into position, fire a volley, and leave before the enemy could respond. There were documented cases of Jeep crews knocking out light German tanks by attacking them from the flank or rear. In Italy, American mountain units adapted Jeeps to transport 75mm recoilless rifles. These light guns could be quickly removed, set up on the ground, fire several shots, and just as quickly loaded back. It became improvised self-propelled artillery for hard-to-reach mountain areas. Medics turned Jeeps into ambulances. Metal frames for stretchers were attached to the hood and sides. One Jeep could evacuate 3 to 4 wounded simultaneously, one on the hood, 2 on the sides, and another in the back seat if the wound allowed sitting. The open body simplified loading the wounded and allowed medics to provide care while moving. Ambulance drivers in Jeeps became true heroes. They drove under fire, often unarmed, marked only by red crosses. In the mountains of Italy, Jeep ambulances climbed trails where pack mules could barely pass. During the Battle of Anzio, medics made runs to the front line every 20 minutes, evacuating wounded from right under the Germans' noses. Signal Corps troops used Jeeps as mobile radio stations. They mounted powerful transmitters on the rear platform, attached antennas to the frame. This created a mobile command post that could maintain contact with aviation, artillery, and higher command. Some Jeeps were equipped with entire communications nodes with several radio stations on different frequencies. Combat engineers adapted Jeeps for mine clearing. They welded a heavy metal frame with rollers to the front, which rolled ahead of the vehicle and detonated mines. Of course, this was dangerous work. Any anti-tank mine would send the Jeep airborne. But for clearing roads, the method worked. The most unusual application was floating Jeeps. Engineers developed a special waterproof casing and propeller driven by the transmission. These seeps, from Sea Jeep, could exit a landing craft right into the water and make their way to shore under their own power. During the Normandy landings, several hundred floating Jeeps were used. However, buoyancy was minimal. The vehicle sat in the water up to the gunnels. Any wave could flood the engine, and then the Jeep became a one-ton anchor. Drivers of floating Jeeps were perhaps the bravest people in the Army. They went in the first wave of the assault, knowing the chances of reaching shore were about 50-50. In the Pacific theater, the Jeep faced completely different conditions. Instead of deserts and roads, impenetrable jungles, volcanic sand, coral reefs. It seemed that a vehicle created for Europe wouldn't survive the tropical test. But the Jeep again proved its versatility. On Pacific Islands, it became an indispensable means of transportation. The narrow wheelbase allowed it to squeeze between trees on trails laid by the Japanese. The simple design easily tolerated humidity that killed more complex machinery. On Guadalcanal, Marines used Jeeps for perimeter patrols. One Jeep with a machine gun replaced a dozen foot soldiers. Speed allowed quick response to enemy breakthroughs and rapid transfer of firepower to threatened sectors. In Burma, British units came up with a brutal but effective tactic for dealing with Japanese snipers. Between two Jeeps, they stretched a steel cable about 6 feet off the ground. Then the vehicles crashed into the jungle at full speed, and the cable literally cut down everything in its path, including snipers sitting in trees. In the Philippines during the liberation of the islands, the Jeep became the partisans' primary transport. Americans dropped disassembled vehicles by parachute into the jungle where resistance units operated. Partisans assembled Jeeps in a few hours and used them for lightning raids on Japanese garrisons. The toughest test came in Italy, with its mountains and narrow mountain roads. The Apennines weren't made for automobiles, only for mules and pedestrians. But the American Army was advancing, and they needed to deliver ammunition, evacuate the wounded, maintain communications. Jeep drivers accomplished the impossible. They climbed goat trails with drops of hundreds of feet, forded mountain streams where water reached the hood, made their way through destroyed villages under artillery fire. In the winter of 1943 to 44, the cold in the mountains was so severe that oil in engines froze, but Jeeps kept working. During the Battle of Monte Cassino, one of the bloodiest episodes of the Italian campaign, Jeeps became the only reliable transport. Roads were constantly destroyed by artillery. Bridges were blown up, but the small, nimble vehicles found detours, forded streams, squeezed between craters. There's a documented case where a medical Jeep driver made 7 runs to the front lines in one night, evacuating wounded from a surrounded battalion. The road was constantly swept by German machine gun fire, but the driver simply turned off the headlights and went at maximum speed. He received the Silver Star, and his Jeep was installed in a museum after the war as a monument to bravery. Under the Lend-Lease program, the Soviet Union received about 52,000 Jeep Willys MBs. This was a significant number, considering that domestic production of light vehicles in the USSR during the war had almost stopped. Red Army soldiers gave the American vehicle several nicknames. Most often, they simply called it Willis or a Willis from the manufacturer's name. Sometimes they said Little Goat for its ability to jump over potholes and climb any slope. Less common, but there was the nickname Flea for its small size and nimbleness. Soviet military personnel quickly appreciated the American vehicle's virtues. The main thing was that the Jeep started in any frost. Domestic Gaz 60s, 70s, and Zis 5s had to be warmed up with blowtorches in winter. Otherwise, the oil in the crankcase froze solid. The Willys started on the first try, even at -22 Fahrenheit. The second important quality was reliability. The simple design rarely broke, and repairs could be done in field conditions with improvised tools. Soviet mechanics said the Jeep could be fixed with a hammer and a curse. Domestic machinery required special tools and spare parts, which often weren't available at the front. Commanders of all ranks tried to get an American Jeep for themselves. This wasn't a question of prestige, but of survival. Speed and cross-country ability allowed quick escape from artillery fire, bypassing problem areas, being first to reach division headquarters with an important report. Marshal Zhukov personally drove a Willys MB, and after the war, called it the best vehicle he'd ever driven. Zhukov had several Jeeps, one for trips to the front, another as a backup. When someone expressed surprise that a marshal needed an American vehicle, he answered simply, "Because it's reliable." Scouts especially valued the Jeep for its speed and maneuverability. A reconnaissance group in 2 or 3 vehicles could go on a deep raid behind enemy lines, capture prisoners or documents, and return before dawn. The Germans quickly learned to recognize the characteristic sound of the Willys engine and treated the appearance of these vehicles with great respect and caution. Artillerymen used Jeeps as tractors for light anti-tank guns. The American vehicle easily towed a 45mm gun or 57mm Zis-2 cannon. This created a mobile anti-tank group capable of quickly taking position, repelling a tank attack, and just as quickly changing location. Signal Corps troops laid telephone lines with Jeeps. A reel of wire was mounted on the back, and the vehicle unwound cable as it moved. In one day, a single vehicle could lay dozens of miles of communication line. Of course, these lines were constantly severed by artillery, but they were just as quickly repaired or new ones laid. After the war, many Jeeps remained in the Soviet Union. They were used in civilian institutions, transferred to collective farms and forestry enterprises. Some worked until the 1960s. Veterans remembered the American vehicles fondly. The Willys was a reliable comrade during the worst years of the war. On June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord began, the Allied landing in Normandy. The Jeep played one of the key roles in this operation. Vehicles were loaded onto landing craft by the hundreds. They were dropped by parachute with the airborne troops. They drove onto the beach straight out of the water. In the first hours of the landing, when chaos reigned on the beach, it was Jeeps that connected scattered units. Officers in these vehicles drove around positions, restored command, organized defense of the beachheads. Medical Jeeps evacuated wounded from beaches where there were no roads, only sand and stone. When the Allies broke out of Normandy and the rapid advance across France began, the Jeep proved to be the ideal vehicle for pursuit. Reconnaissance units in these vehicles went tens of miles ahead, found bypass routes around German fortifications, captured bridges before they could be blown up. There's a famous case where a group of 6 jeeps was first to burst into Paris in August 1944. Parisians didn't immediately understand these were liberators. The vehicles were too small and plain-looking. But when they saw the American stars on the hoods, real jubilation began. In the winter of 1944–45, the Germans' last major offensive on the Western Front began, the Battle of the Bulge. The sudden strike in conditions of fog and snowstorm created a critical situation. German tanks broke through the front on a wide sector, and several American divisions faced the threat of encirclement. Under these conditions, the Jeep again proved its worth. On snow-covered roads where trucks and even tanks got stuck, the small vehicles kept moving. They delivered orders, ammunition, shuttled commanders between isolated units. Medical jeeps evacuated wounded from surrounded towns, sometimes passing within a few hundred yards of German positions. One of the most dramatic episodes of the Battle of the Bulge involved a medical jeep driven by Private Thomas Lawson. His unit was surrounded in a small village. Lawson made 3 runs under fire, evacuating critically wounded to the nearest aid station. After the 3rd run, his jeep was riddled with bullet holes. The radiator was leaking, the engine smoking. But the vehicle still moved. Lawson saved 11 men and received the Silver Star for bravery. In the spring of 1945, when the Allies forced the Rhine and entered Germany, jeeps were everywhere. In photographs of the meeting of American and Soviet troops on the Elbe, you can see how officers of both armies arrived at the meeting in jeeps, American Willys MBs. This became symbolic. The same vehicle served the Allies on different fronts. When the war in Europe ended, the Jeep participated in the occupation of Germany. Military police patrols in these vehicles maintained order in destroyed cities. Signal Corps troops restored communications. Medics helped the civilian population. In the Pacific, the war continued for several more months. Jeeps landed on Okinawa, the last major island before the invasion of Japan itself. When Japan capitulated in August 1945, American troops entered the country. And again, jeeps were in the front ranks. During World War II, 640,000 jeeps were produced. That's more than all German tanks throughout the entire war. That's more than British, American, and Soviet tanks combined. A simple vehicle costing $750 became a symbol of American military might. General George Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, called the Jeep one of the 3 most important tools of victory, alongside the landing craft and the Dakota transport aircraft. General Eisenhower said the Jeep was America's most important contribution to modern warfare. These weren't just nice words. This was the truth. The Jeep served on all fronts, in all climatic zones, in any weather. It carried generals and privates, machine guns and wounded, ammunition and mail. It was a scout, medic, signalman, artilleryman. It was everywhere the American Army was. After the war, military Jeeps got a second life. Thousands of vehicles remained in Europe and were used for rebuilding the destroyed economy. In Italy, Jeeps delivered mail to mountain villages. In France, farmers used them as tractors. In Germany, Jeeps became the first transport for the reviving police force. In America, returning veterans bought surplus military Jeeps at auctions for next to nothing. They converted the vehicles into civilian automobiles, installed soft tops, repainted them, removed military equipment. This began the era of civilian off-road vehicles. Willys Overland quickly understood the potential, and in 1945 began producing a civilian version, the CJ2A. This was essentially the same military Jeep, but with some conveniences. More comfortable seats, improved lighting, the ability to install various attachments. Farmers loved civilian Jeeps for their versatility. The vehicle plowed, harrowed, mowed grass, hauled loads, pulled out stuck tractors. You could drive a Jeep to town on rough roads and return with purchases. It was a true helper for all occasions. Gradually, the Jeep became a cultural phenomenon. Owner clubs appeared, off-road competitions, specialized magazines. The Jeep became a symbol of freedom, adventure, the ability to overcome obstacles. Everyone who got behind the wheel of this vehicle felt a connection to those who fought in Jeeps during the war. The Jeep brand survived many owners. Willys sold to Kaiser Motors, then American Motors, then Chrysler, and finally, Jeep became part of Fiat Chrysler automobiles. But despite all the changes, the vehicles continued to be called Jeeps, and each new model retained features of its military ancestor: the vertical grille, round headlights, angular forms. Today, 80 years after the end of the war, Jeep remains one of the most recognizable automotive brands in the world. Modern models with air conditioning, multimedia systems, and airbags bear little resemblance to the Spartan military Willys MB. But the spirit remains the same: readiness to go where others can't, ability to overcome any obstacles, reliability in the toughest conditions. Many military Jeeps have survived to our day. Enthusiasts carefully restore them, display them at military equipment exhibitions, use them in historical reenactments. These vehicles are a living link to the generation that saved the world from tyranny. The World War II-era Jeep proved a simple truth. Sometimes, the most important weapon isn't a tank or an aircraft, but a reliable, simple vehicle that just does its job, day after day, in any conditions. Soldiers trusted their lives to the Jeep, and it didn't let them down. That's a true legend.